You're listening to the Two Guys Talking Podcast Network.
It's a blistery winter night in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. SWAT operator Gary McDougall is sitting in waist-high snow. Right now, he's contemplating his career decisions. As he knows, there's negotiators sitting warm and cozy, drinking coffee in a trailer. It's time we learned Gary's transition from SWAT operator to negotiator and hear about his storied career. Welcome to the Crisis Cop Podcast. Joining us today in the knock is a good friend and colleague of mine who spent 25 years in the Calgary Police Service, the last 9 of those as a crisis negotiator. Mr. Gary McDougall. Gary, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us a little bit about yourself.
I do, Pat, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to you, friend, and to Crisis Cop. Gary McDougall is my name. I was a police officer up here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada for 26 years. And as Pat mentioned, the last 9 years that I was here, I was one of the team leaders, one of the coordinators from our crisis negotiation team. So I retired from the police service here after 25 years and formed a training company called Conflict Solutions. And now I am on the speaking circuit and I travel around and I meet amazing people every week talking about things like crisis negotiation, workplace violence, business negotiation, do a lot of stuff around communication skills, conflict management. Those are the kinds of things that I teach now. And it's an absolute privilege to do that. I get to travel around the world, Pat, and meet amazing people. Some of it is done from my home, like the NTOA courses that we do. Some of you may or may not know, but Pat and I are instructors at the National Tactical Officers Association. And we sometimes travel and sometimes we do these courses virtually, these 40-hour online basic negotiation courses. So it's a privilege to do this kind of work. And I'm honored to be on your podcast today, Pat. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out, Gary. And so one of the things that kind of Gary mentioned it. So me and Gary first met back, and I don't know how many years it was, at one of these conferences. It was the Missouri conference, hence why I'm wearing my Missouri shirt. And I got to know Gary a little bit more, and then we actually got to start training together, doing 40-hour basic classes. And it's just been a pleasure, Gary. And the thing is it's like every time we do a class, I mean, just for me personally, I learned something new. I learned something new from you and the other Gary Robertson, our other colleague. And then from the students, I think it's just great listening to their perspectives and how they, progress through the class. I mean, if that's something you want to talk about.
Yeah, 100%. It's lifelong learning. They sign up for our courses so that they can learn the craft of crisis negotiation. But the reality is that they too are subject matter experts, Pat. They are either crisis folks from their law enforcement agency. They may well be peer support folks. They may well be mental health professionals. They may be correctional people. The reality, though, is they bring a myriad of skills to the table. So to your point, Pat, we oftentimes do learn from them almost as much as they learn from us. And it's lots of fun. It's super engaging. You think that an online virtual 40-hour course would be, make you want to stand on the ledge. But the reality is that it really flows. And I think that with 3 instructors, people get a variety of different learning styles and strategies. So yeah, huge value, friend. Huge value.
Absolutely. So Gary, tell us a little bit about how you got into the world of crisis negotiation. You're 20-something, 25 years police officer, but you found your niche, I guess, those last 9 years. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. The interesting part is that I was a SWAT officer for a whole bunch of years. And I remember one night laying in a snowbank, watching a house through the scope of a sniper rifle and thinking to myself, those negotiators, they're in that nice warm trailer and they're drinking hot chocolate and eating microwave popcorn. I went to university. Why am I laying in a snowbank watching this house? And I thought, there might be some value instead, perhaps, of parlaying that experience, the SWAT experience, into the crisis negotiation piece. And the beauty is, Pat, and there's a real nice interface here in that many years ago, SWAT and the negotiators would operate, as separate entities. And Pat, being a team commander for many years, that there's been a really nice integration. And I think there's huge value, I think, in having that SWAT background, understanding what it is that the negotiators do and what the negotiators understanding what our SWAT friends do. So that was kind of the genesis for me getting into this. I've always been a real fan of the whole communication piece, the negotiation piece, the psychology of what it is that we do. And so for me, that was the transition from being a SWAT person into being a crisis negotiator.
And you know, it's funny because I find, just going through some of these classes, we're getting more and more of those guys that were the SWAT guys. And let's be honest, that's kind of a young man's game, right? Eventually our bodies break down and like you said, we can't sit out in the snow as long as we used to be able to. Now, I didn't have that background, but I always liked to get into that world though. So anytime I saw a SWAT officer, I just kind of dig into their brain and see what they were thinking from their perspective. And it's, you kind of brought that up. It's important. We're all on the same team. And, unfortunately, there's some teams across the country where a lot of times their SWAT teams and negotiation teams don't train together. And you can see the big disconnect. And, I think that's one of the things we're really trying to push is you have to have that parallel approach and you all have to be on the same page. And it's important to have both aspects of the SWAT world and the negotiation world.
Right. You're absolutely right, Pat. And I don't know that we would flourish. I don't know that we would be successful in the work that we did if we didn't have sort of our SWAT brothers and sisters behind us. I've heard it characterized in the past as they are the iron fist and we are the velvet glove that covers that iron fist. I'm not sure if you've heard that reference before, but to me that just makes a lot of sense. We would not be successful in what we do potentially without our SWAT friends behind us.
So Gary, one of the questions I get asked a lot, is, hey, I want to try out for a negotiation team. What should I do or what could I do? So if you had to give a new negotiator some advice or what you think makes a good negotiator, what's some things Gary McDougall is looking for or things you think is important in that aspect?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. My advice for new negotiators or people who aspire to be negotiators is get involved in the negotiation process. Get involved in, maybe being a quarry or maybe assisting in the role-playing piece for negotiators and their training. One of the things that I've often found, though, is that when folks become new negotiators, particularly law enforcement people, maybe to a lesser extent corrections friends and maybe our mental health friends as well, one of the things that is the big thing, Pat, and you and I see this in our virtual courses, month after month after month, is we see negotiators, and the biggest downfall, I think, is they go to problem solving too soon. And Pat, we've had this conversation before.
Yeah.
And if you think about why that is, friend, it makes all the sense in the world that people go to problem solving. When we are presented as a law enforcement officer with a problem, what is it we do? Well, we solve that problem. It's exactly what we do from day to day to day. So it's no wonder that becomes our default or our de facto strategy. Somebody presents a problem. Guess what? Well, we're gonna offer a solution. And the reality is, Pat, and we've talked about this many times before, is you have to earn the right to go to problem solving. So, people present, oh yeah, I'm angry because my wife left me and I'm suicidal. Well, okay, that's really an unfortunate situation. Maybe we can get you some help, or I know a friend who's a counselor. We can solve that problem. But again, you got to earn the right to do that. You have to earn the right by working that behavioral change staircase. You have to earn the right by developing rapport, developing relationship, developing credibility. So we earn the right by doing those kinds of things. So avoid problem solving, I would suggest, would be a really, really critical piece. One of the other things that oftentimes happens is we say, we're going to select this negotiator because they could talk people down from here. They could talk people there. And the reality is, and this, Pat, better than anyone, it's not about talking, it's about listening. So let's not select somebody based on their ability to talk. Let's select them based on their ability to listen. Let's listen people down off a ledge. Let's listen people down off a bridge or off of a building. So those are the kinds of pieces that I would recommend to a new negotiator, is really, really stay away from those kinds of problem-solving behaviors. The other piece is, and one of the things that I strongly, strongly believe in, is that we spend an inordinate amount of our time coming from that place of advocacy. We think that someone's standing on top of a bridge or standing on top of a building, and it's our job to give them information or to advocate to them. So we'll say, hey, you got to quit crack, or you got to quit meth, or you got to move home, or you got to see your kids, or you got to dry out, or you got to go to treatment. And the problem is, Pat, and you know this better than anyone, is that those people are standing on top of bridges. And they're standing on top of buildings because people have advocated to them their whole lives. And so respectfully, there's very, very little appetite for them when we come from that place of advocacy. So let's flip that script and let's not spend time coming from advocacy, which means giving people information. And instead, maybe there's value for us in coming from a place of inquiry, coming from that place of curiosity. Wow, friend, you're standing on top of this building, thinking about doing something pretty extreme. If you're comfortable talking to me about this, I'd be honored if you'd share with me what's going on for you. What brings you here? Why today? Why not a week ago? So we really compare and contrast, and we do this in our basic negotiation course, compare and contrast the communication strategy of advocacy, which means giving information, versus inquiry, which means seeking information, as you well know.
Right. Several great points there. So let's just go back to the one about the talker. It's funny because when we have negotiator selections, that's what I hear a lot is, hey, why do you want to be a negotiator? Or why do you think you'd be a good negotiator? And their default's always, well, I'm a good talker, right? And then we have to kind of go back and reverse, be like, hold on. We need good talkers, obviously, but we need better listeners, right? So we always throw out that 80-20 rule that we talk about in class. 80% of the time you should be listening, 20% of the time you should be talking. And we really strike on that. And I think when we find those troubles, as like Gary kind of mentioned, is those people that go straight to problem solving. Because unfortunately, that's what we're taught as police officers, because we have so many problems we got to solve. Go to call, right? And it's funny you bring up the advocacy versus inquiry because of I always think of that exercise we do in class, right? Where we tell them, hey, it's the buyer seller exercise. You're trying to sell something. And what is it? Like 99% of the time, the person selling that product is the one doing the talking, right? And it's when we stress, hey, you should have been doing more listening at what that person wanted, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that becomes when we have if I can reinforce that point, Pat, I think you're right on point in that when we have a strong opinion about something, when we really, really like something, we often default to a place of advocacy. Or when we really don't like something, we default to that place of advocacy. When we have a strong opinion, one way or the other, oftentimes that becomes our default response. And the reality is, and I appreciated you putting that 80-20 rule on the table, Pat, because that's what we subscribe to. 80% of our time we spend in inquiry, getting curious, and 20% of our time coming from that place of advocacy. I think we've agreed on this, Pat, in the past, that there are times in which you have to come from that place of advocacy. There are times in which you have to. Like if we're in a big training room together, Pat, and the building catches fire, I'm going to say, Pat, this building's on fire. We got to go. Like that's advocacy. Inquiry is not appropriate there. Hey, Pat, the building's on fire. Hey, what are your thoughts on fire? Hey, I like fire. Have you ever been burned? What's your favorite color?
Exactly.
Where it's appropriate and where time permits, to your point, Pat, advocacy sometimes has to happen. For the most part, we're 80-20 inquiry.
Exactly. So let's talk about active listening. I think that's probably the most important skills we kind of teach in our classes. And how important is it that the students, grasp the active listening, and as a negotiator, that you actually use your active listening skills?
100%. As a negotiator, as a spouse, as a friend, as a colleague, as a crisis intervener, those active listening skills are at the foundation of everything that we do. And in our virtual course, we spend a huge portion of our training talking about active listening skills because it's critically important. And oftentimes people will say, well, you know what, how do you talk to somebody who's intoxicated? Or how do you talk to somebody who's suffering from a mental illness? How do you do that? Well, I'm going to suggest respectfully that those active listening skills are the absolute best thing we've got. And when we talk about active listening skills, it's that subset of communication. We talk about mirroring behaviors. We talk about paraphrasing. We talk about labeling an emotion. We talk about effective pauses. We talk about open-ended questions. We talk about all of those kinds of things. And that's foundational. That's one of the cornerstones of what it is that keeps us or allows us to be successful is those active listening skills. Because they are designed, Pat, and you know this well, they're designed to allow people to understand or recognize the fact, not only am I listening to you, friend, but I'm also going to prove to you that I'm listening. And I'm going to prove it by giving you back your message, yet in my words. So the active listening skills, absolutely foundational to the work that we do, as negotiators, as spouses, as friends, as colleagues in life. I think that active listening carries us a long way. Because our success or failure, I think, as human beings is predicated on our ability to maintain or improve relationships. And those active listening skills, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again, foundational.
So I don't know about you, but just I'm thinking about throughout my career, once I became a negotiator, there was still that pushback from some law enforcement. They didn't like the idea of, why are you talking to this guy? This guy doesn't deserve us. Why are we spending our time listening to what this dude has to say? Did you find some of that in your career, and how did you deal with that that perspective?
Yeah, there's a little bit of pushback. People think that it's soft, and people equate it, Pat, and you've heard this before. Oh yeah, we're going to sit around and sing Kumbaya and hold hands with this guy and maybe do arts and crafts. The reality is whether you're a hardened criminal barricaded in a place, or whether you're somebody suicidal, being barricaded in your own home, The reality is people just want to be heard, listened to, and validated. And, if it wasn't for active listening skills, and I know sometimes people push back and say, yeah, it's that real soft approach, let's do things differently. The reality is this has been around since I started in policing a very long time ago, and active listening, it's foundational. I know I keep using that word, Pat, over and over again, but it's one of the cornerstones, I think, that allows us to have success.
So going back on that, is there a memorable negotiation where all this came together and then it kind of, it worked and you kind of saw some of these people's ideas now like, hey, you know what, maybe this thing actually works. Maybe this is something I should maybe think more about.
Yeah, lots of those situations in which people, coming out of the gate were a little bit critical, thinking, yeah, you know what, I'm not sure if this is going to work for us. And the reality is, at the end of the day, it's the best that we have. It's the best that we have. So I can harken back to a number of different situations or circumstances in which active listening was as at the core of our success in an engagement with somebody.
So is there any case that, kind of sticks with you where you go back and think, maybe this didn't go the way I thought it would go, or just something that stuck out that you remember throughout your career that's one of those memorable cases?
Yeah, there was a couple of situations. I harken back to probably the longest negotiation that I was ever involved in, and it involved a gentleman who, and I use that word gentleman, I use that word loosely because it was a gentleman who was functionally living a double life. He lived in the city that I live in, and he had a relationship here with a lady here, and they had a child together, so they were living common law here. All the while, he was legally married to a lady who lived in another part of the country. And so functionally, he was living a double life. And so he would spend a week here with his I guess, common law family. And then he would say, honey, I've got some business in another part of this country. And so he'd jump on a plane and spend a week there and a week back and a week forward. And this went on for a couple of years. And then one day, unfortunately and sadly for him, their wires crossed. And they'd be, well, no, that's my husband. No, that's my husband. Well, we've got a kid. You've got a what? Are you kidding? And his world blew up that day. So he became very suicidal that day. And he jumped in his car and he was driving up and down the highway in and out of our city here. And he was working the phones. And this guy was an incredibly powerful business negotiator. He was the CEO of a very large and very recognizable organization here in my city. And so he made a number of suicidal references to his wife that lived here in this city. And so she got quite concerned and she called the distress center here in our city. And the distress center talked to him in his car for a period of time. And then he started to escalate further. So they sent that call up to our 911 call center. And he continued to escalate. So they called in a negotiator. So I went over to our 911 call center with another negotiator. And we got on the phone with this guy. And he was just off the table, just absolutely off, up in the air, knowing that his world had functionally blown up. And the problem was, Pat, that he was a very powerful business negotiator and he knew exactly what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
He knew exactly what we were doing. It was, he said, I know exactly what you're doing. I know what you're going to say. I know where you're going to go with this. You're going to try and build a relationship. And the reality is at the end of the day, and it went on 26 hours, we were online, offline with him for 26 hours. And at the end of the day, what functionally brought him in was the fact that he felt that he'd been heard, listened to, and he felt, some alignment. I certainly had not a lot of sympathy for him, but I certainly did spend some time, developing some empathy and developing some rapport. And finally, we managed to get him in. The sad part was, and sort of the end of the story, was he drank a whole liter of antifreeze, quart of antifreeze before he came in. And so he was in some distress, and we were under some real pressure to sort of get our hands on this fella, and we did. And he ended up coming home, and we put our hands on him. We put him in an ambulance, and he ended up in a hospital for a period of time. But had it not, Pat, so to your question, had it not been for active listening, those kinds of things would have gone right out the window. That we never would have pulled him in here. It never would have happened.
A couple more good points is, we get asked, well, what happens if you're dealing with a fellow negotiator or something? They're going to know your tricks, right? Well, yeah, they are, but that's even more, I think, concrete towards you're going to try and build rapport, right? Well, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try and build rapport with you. I want to help you. So even if they know our tactics, those tactics still work, right? Because it's just that genuine thing of we're going to listen to you and then hopefully get that situation solved. And then you brought up empathy and sympathy. So let's talk about that. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy, and why is that important, Gary?
Yeah, super important. Empathy and sympathy, people oftentimes think that those two are synonymous. And the reality is not that they're on opposite ends of that communication continuum. The reality, though, is empathy is walking a mile in their shoes. It's trying to understand their thoughts and feelings so well that you could describe them for them. And the reality is that empathy, the application of empathy, it's a skill. It's not a memory. You don't have to have had a parallel experience in order to be empathetic. Pat, if you had an uncle that passed away, and I've never ever had an uncle that passed away, I can still be empathetic. I can still put myself in your shoes and try to imagine and potentially use that provisional language. I'm trying to imagine. I'm not in your shoes. I don't profess to be. I can only imagine this must be a very difficult time for you, Pat. I know you were super close to your uncle, and this must be very difficult for you. That's the application of empathy, putting yourself in their shoes. Whereas sympathy, the other side of that coin, Pat, to your point, is really all about an expression of pity or sorrow for the other person. And I don't know that there may be a place in crisis negotiation, but I think that for the most part, empathy is the skill, empathy is the tool. If your child falls and skins their knee, yeah, sympathy's the one. Hey, come here, little friend, let's fix that up. As opposed to empathy. Wow, this must be difficult for you. I too have skinned my knee. Like you wouldn't say that to your child.
Right.
The reality, though, is in the work that we do, it's really all about empathy as opposed to sympathy.
Right. So let's talk about, just being in that position as the primary negotiator and going on some of those long haul outs, maybe that 6, 8, 9, 10 hour negotiation. How does that wear on you as a negotiator? And what are some things you did, after the fact of just realizing that there was a pressure on you and, you have to kind of overcome that and deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's the piece is once you get in the chair, and you know this, Pat, as well as anybody does, any negotiator, once you are in that seat as primary, you're going to need an act of Congress or a tow truck to pull that primary negotiator off. People don't want to leave there. That's what we train for, Pat. That's what we do this for. And when you get in that chair, I just can't wait to get in that chair and put that headset on. And the challenge is that it takes 8 or 10 or sometimes 12 hours. The scenario I just shared with you was 26 is what that was. And we were on again, off again. So we were not online 26 hours. I want to be clear about that. But the beauty is you've got a team around you, right? You've got a coach, a secondary person there. You've got a team leader. You've got an intel person. You are surrounded by a really nice supporting cast. So it's just not your show. It's our show. It's our collective show. And we do that as a team. And in some cases, there's a mental health professional there as well that we use as a resource. So they can help us with that whole fatigue, that whole piece as well. But it's really all about the team approach to this whole thing. And then, you don't want to get out of that chair, but at the end of the day, you go home and you sleep for 12 hours because as you know, it absolutely takes an emotional toll on you when you are that person and you have to be on your game. You can't take an hour off and sort of slide or skate. You really have to be on your game. So the short answer, Pat, to your question is it's really all about a team approach. And that's what allows us to flourish in the kind of work that we do.
Dan, it's funny we talk about team because if, we all know Hollywood, right? But when you watch those Hollywood TV shows or movies depicting that negotiator, we always see that lone guy, that Donnie Wahlberg out there, right? Put his hands up, put the gun down, walking in. And it's never really portrayed that, actually there's a whole team of people working on these crisis situations. And you kind of even dived into it a little bit. We have our primary negotiator, but then we have our coach who's helping our primary, and then all the other components in, parts of the team. So going into that, obviously they're all important roles, but what do you think is the most important, or if not the most difficult role as part of that team, that crisis negotiation team?
Yeah, great question. I think being primary is potentially the one because you're the one that has to be thinking on your feet. You're the one that has to be doing that. So I would say primary is critically important. I would say coach is critically important as well. They're the one who's sitting beside you, adjacent you, writing notes and supporting and doing all those things. So critically important. The intel negotiator, I would love to put an importance on one role or the other, but boy, they're intertwined. There's this synergy that exists. You think about the importance of the intel negotiator, gathering information. And that's one of the things that we sometimes fall down on them. With your permission, Pat, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here for just a second. Intel negotiator, one of the things that happens there sometimes is we get a little bit confused between what is intelligence and what is information. And the function of the intel negotiator is to gather intelligence, not that low-hanging fruit. Because it doesn't matter that the subject is 5'10" 160 pounds with a tattoo of a butterfly. That's
Right.
information. That's not intel. And the primary focus of gathering intelligence is in to develop themes that will support our primary. That's the only reason we have an intel negotiator, in my opinion. Well, not the only. The primary reason is so that we can gather information that will allow us to develop themes. Like, it's great information, the fact that this person's, the subject's spouse was having an extramarital affair. Like, that's good information. But how do we transition that? How do we transpose that into something that's workable as a theme? And for me, the theme would be, wow, friend, sounds like you might feel really betrayed by the relationship that your spouse cultivated with your best friend. So it's really all about gathering that information that supports developing themes for our primary. So intel negotiator, critically important. Team leader, critically important. That person who's the go-between, the liaison between our tactical function and our crisis negotiation folks. So all of those roles are super important. Boards, critically important. Pat, you do a module on boards that I think is a brilliant module, and it really speaks to what's important to put on a board. Like, that board really represents, here is the information that the primary and coach need to have at a glance. And that's functionally why we do boards. Scribe, critically important. If this scenario or this situation ever ends up in a coroner's inquiry or some sort of an inquest, like, the notes that the scribe has written, absolutely critical, absolutely critical. So there's this real interdependency amongst all of those roles. So if you asked, and I want to go back to your question, which do you think are the more important of the roles? I think they're absolutely all critically important. Obviously, the primary would be at the top of that list as well. So,
Right. And I think it's funny when we do our little scenario day, we have everybody break into those roles. I think everybody always wants to be that primary. But then I think at the end of the day, when you hear the students talk, they actually start realizing, kind of like what you said, man, every role is important in this negotiation. Every player has a play in this playbook. And it's funny because when you miss that person, you can kind of see it sometimes. Obviously, if you don't have that intelligence person, that's where you're going to lack, right? We didn't have any of that information, that intelligence that could have helped us in that situation. I think it's really interesting watching how the students, because when everybody wants to be that primary negotiator, they want to be that voice. But then when they realize all these other duties and like how important they are, I think they get a better grasp of understanding the team concept, which, as you said, it's the most important thing. You have to be that team player.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
So, going kind of with that, did you have any mentors, or do you even, I don't want to go back too far in time, but do you remember like your first negotiation class? Who taught it, or what did you glean out of that, or what's something that aha moment for you?
Yeah, a whole bunch of those kinds of things. And I will tell you that I'm going to put a plug in for the guy that was the team leader up here in my city. His name was Greg Harris, and he has forgotten more about crisis negotiation than I will ever remember. And he got me involved. And our basic negotiation happens up here. The course happens through the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Ottawa, in our nation's capital up here. And it's a 2-week basic course, and they sort of teach you the fundamentals and the basics. And then they bring you back, and for the first year or so, you are required to be that person who is, the coach or the secondary. You have to take on another role other than being primary. But, Pat, I appreciate the opportunity here. I want to throw some names out here. Now, I know that some of the listeners may well not know these people, but I think I'd be remiss if we were here to talk about kind of the foundations of crisis negotiation. I think about the Gary Nesners of this world.
Right.
Here's a guy who was the unit chief for the crisis negotiation group out of Quantico, and here's a guy who is still on the speaking circuit. He was the lead negotiator at Waco, Texas. Many, many, many years ago, and I don't mean to make him sound old. He's been around a long time, and he still just brings it.
Right.
He's still just a super guy. There's a gentleman named Vince Delfonso, who was also an instructor there, who had a huge, huge impact on me. Vince, just a phenomenal negotiator and an amazing, amazing speaker as well. I think about the people that we teach with, Pat. Like, I think of the Harry Druckers of this world, the Victor Torres, the Sean Pollacks, the Jeff Caudill, and those guys have been around for a really long time. But I think about the Jeff Caudill. He's a former Marine, U.S. Marine, and he does an absolutely brilliant piece on negotiating with veterans, returning veterans. Harry Drucker was a negotiator for over 25 years and still brings a huge degree of freshness, a real nice element. Victor Torres recently came out with a piece on negotiating with adolescents, negotiating with the youth, which we really, really need. I think about a lady named Deb McMahon, who operates a training company out of Missouri. And I'd take a bullet for Deb McMahon. She is so open and so free with her information and so supportive. And she operates a training company. And I learned something from her every conversation. And she surrounded herself with some amazing people, the Jan Dubinas out of Phoenix, the Ben Wetzels out of Phoenix.
Yeah.
Those are people that really, really bring it. Scott Tillema is another guy who was a crisis negotiator for a bunch of years and then retired. And now he's operating an incredibly powerful, incredibly lucrative trading business. Yeah. There's a business with unending integrity. Pat, I know he's a friend of yours. He's certainly a friend of mine. Those are the kinds of people that I think have been really important in the development of this work, certainly have had impact in the work that I do. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about a guy named Pat Doring, who's not only a friend, but a mentor and a guy that I'm just honored to teach with as well.
Wow, some great names there, Gary. And what's going to be really cool is hopefully we can get every one of those on the Guest of the Crisis Cop podcast, because you know what, like you said, everybody has that story. I think that's one of the unique things about the crisis negotiation community is I've done a lot of different things in law enforcement, and sometimes you get in that niche to where people don't want to share stuff. They want to be that expert and they want to kind of push you away and be like, no, that's my stuff. But man, I'm telling you, the negotiation community, it's one of the, like you said, just willing to share stuff. And at the end of the day, we're trying to do everything for the greater good. I think that's why we're, in my opinion, the best negotiation. We're the best community in law enforcement negotiators because we do that. We share that information. We're a close-knit community. We tend to know each other. And I think that's what really drives us, is just keeping with that mantra of, we're here to save lives at the end of the day.
No, you're absolutely right. And I really want to underscore what you just said, that sort of people's willingness to share their stuff. I think of Troy King out of Portland. He's retired now. He's teaching for Deb. Here's a guy, you got a video? Yeah, you want it? Yeah, you can have it. You know what? You want this flow chart? You want those slides? You can have that. And all those people that I cited are so free and willing to share the stuff that they have. But you're in that same boat. You've got some great stuff that you've amassed over the years, and you're always willing to share that stuff, which I certainly appreciate. I know that our colleagues do as well.
All right, so let's kind of jump back into that new negotiator. So let's say I'm that guy. I see the flyer. Hey, you want to be a negotiator? What's going to jump out for that person? What should they be doing to prepare themselves for that interview or that test they may have to take to get on that team?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I think that it's really wise for you to do your homework. I think it's wise for you to do a little bit of research. I think it's wise for you to talk to existing negotiators. I think you don't have to be a negotiator to attend a negotiator conference. And I think there's value potentially in going to conferences and getting that information. It's wise for you to do some research, to read some books. When I think of books, I think of Gary Nesner's book called Stalling for Time. I think about Dr. Robert Cialdini, who was a professor at University of Chicago for a bunch of years, and he is the founding father of the work we do around influence. And he wrote a book many, many years ago, and there's been more iterations of that. It's called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. And he talks about the 6, now 7, because he's introduced the 7th, theories of social influence. What does that look like? Because, the important piece here is everything that we do, Pat, in the work that we do, contains a request for behavior change. We are constantly asking people to do more of the things we want them to do less of the things we don't want them to do. And so, it's about reading that, doing that kind of research, the Dr. Cialdini's work, the work of, Pat, you've got a 2 or maybe 3 books out. I don't want to misquote you here, but I think that, is it 2 or 3 books that you've got?
3 out now. Yeah.
3 out now. Yeah. Nicely done. So to back to your question, a new negotiator should be reading those kinds of books, maybe attending conferences, maybe inviting or asking if you can assist on role-playing day when your teams are training. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be getting to. Other books, I think of a pure negotiation book, something called Getting to Yes, which was written by 4 Harvard professors, William Ury, Roger Fisher. There was a number of professors at the University of Harvard University, and they wrote a book on pure negotiation. And it talks about interest-based negotiation. It talks about the importance of understanding what it is that's important to you and what's important to the other side. And that applies directly to business negotiation, and it applies absolutely anecdotally to crisis negotiation, the work that we do. So that's a book called Getting to Yes. And then later on, they wrote a book called Getting Past No. Those are the kinds of things that I would be looking at. So go to conferences, assist as a role player, read some books, talk to some existing negotiators, watch podcasts, continue to monitor the news for crisis negotiation kinds of events. I know, Pat, you've got a link, and I'd invite you to sort of share that with our listeners as well. I think you've got a link that you link into when there's a barricade or a situation.
Yeah, those Google alerts.
Yeah, maybe you could speak to that.
So Google alerts, it's something I can't even remember how I found it out, but you can go into the Google machine, as we like to call it, right? And put certain keywords in there you're looking for. So some of my top ones are, police standoff, crisis negotiation, hostage negotiation. So anytime that those words hit anything in Google, it'll send me a link, and I'll have, I usually get 2 or 3 a day on different things that are happening relation to those things. So like hostage negotiation, it's going to give me something in the realm of hostage negotiation that may be going around, not just the U.S., but around the world. And like Gary said, it's important to catch up on those things, read those articles, and kind of see what those trends are. And I think one of the most important things is, and I say this a lot, but you have to drink the Kool-Aid. If you're one of those people that are applying to be a negotiator because you want that checkbox or you want that on your resume, or it helps you in that promotional process, you may find yourself on a team, but I'm going to tell you, if that's what your goal is, you're probably going to find yourself off the team just as quick as you got on that team, because we look for the people that are passionate, like the people, Gary rattled off. All those people, in my opinion, have drank the Kool-Aid. And I think that's what we're really looking for.
100%. No, I couldn't agree with you more. 100%.
So in law enforcement, sometimes they call it that dark humor or whatever you want to say, but anything that kind of comes out after you, that after looking at it, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that really happened. It's one of those comical moments that maybe you didn't think about it at the time, but it just kind of hits you after the fact of, man, I really can't believe this happened.
I could think of one very specifically, and it involved a husband and wife situation, and they were active meth addicts. And she woke up one morning and said, hey, you know what? I think we should check into treatment. I think that's what we should do. And he said, I'm not interested in doing that. She said, well, then you're on your own, because today is the first day of my sobriety. So she traveled, she made her way down to a treatment center in downtown here in my city, and she checked into this big, beautiful treatment center. And he stayed at home all day and got higher and higher and higher. Then at about 9 o'clock that night, he decided, why would she do this to me? She's really ruined our thing. He somehow perceived himself to be the victim. Mm-hmm. So he hatched this plan whereby he was going to go down to the treatment center and figure out what room she was in. And his plan was that he was going to hang himself in a tree right outside her window. Wow. So that she'd get up the next morning, Pat, open up her curtains on the first day of her sobriety and see him hanging in a tree. And that was his crazy, crazy, insidious plan. So I don't know how he managed to do this, but he found his way from the Northeast community in my city to downtown. And he went into that park, and he had gone to his garage in advance and got himself, 100 feet of that non-stretchy nylon yellow camping rope, that kind of camping rope. When he climbed up this tree about 30 feet, he tied the rope around his neck, he tied the rope around the tree, and he was just about to jump. And there was a gentleman walking through the park and saw this guy up in this tree and said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm going to kill myself. Leave me alone. And the guy said, not on my watch. The guy gets on his phone. He calls 911. We scrambled some first responders. And then I ended up down there talking to this guy for a period of time. And we've been talking for about 10 or 15 minutes. And I don't know why, Pat. In my head, I thought this was the right thing to say. I said to him, you know what, friend, it seems to me that you're at the end of your rope. He looked at me, and I thought, right. Whoop. Yeah, whoop, indeed. He said, did you just say that? I said, I think I did. And he started laughing. And that for me, that was tacit approval. And I kind of chuckled a bit. I said, I am so sorry. I didn't mean that at all. And he said, no, that's brilliant. That's very, very funny. And we talked for a little while, and then he came down, and that was the end of it. But, to the teaching point that comes out of this, Pat, is the fact that, you can have those blunders. You can really You can step on it as long as you've earned that right. As long as you've got that compassion, you've got that empathy, you've got those pieces already in place, you can get away with that. And you know what? He didn't hold that against me. Some people may have, but boy, that was not my intent in saying you seem to be at the end of your rope. And so that's kind of how that played out. Yeah.
Again, some good points there. So the first off is, and we teach this a lot, sometimes you're going to say stuff that just comes out wrong, right? Perfect example right there, right? But it's okay, right? You can recover from a verbal mistake. Sometimes you may have to apologize. Man, that's not what I meant, that kind of thing. But it's okay because, we're not perfect. I think something new negotiators always think of is they think they're going to have that what would we call it, that Hollywood line, right? They're going to have that one hitter line that they're going to deliver that, and bam, that guy's going to sink in, and that next thing he's coming out of that house, right? And we all know that's not the reality. That's not really what happens. But also going into the humor part, I think humor does have a part in negotiations. If you want to talk a little bit more about that, how as human beings, it's okay for us to laugh sometimes, even in the most grim situations, right?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes that's appropriate. And sometimes it's okay to use humor. For me, the barometer is whether they started it or not. You're talking to somebody who's potentially suicidal. One of the things that could potentially happen is if you sort of crack a joke and it's not very well received by our subject, we have to be a little bit careful with that. A little bit careful. So for me, the barometers, if they started, and if you think you've earned the right to do that, because you know what? Humor can really enhance relationships.
Right.
And you can show people that you're human by using humor. You got to be a little bit careful with it, as you've alluded to as well, though, Pat, in that, sometimes we'll crack a joke or we'll maybe say something that might be a little bit humorous. And if they take it wrong, now you're back to that piece that you talked about a minute ago where you got to apologize.
Right.
Because the reality is, okay, it's the worst day of my life. I'm thinking about killing myself, and you think this is funny. Friend, I don't think this is funny at all. So it can tend to come back and bite us in the backside. But the use of humor, I think, if you earn the right to do it, fine. It's like, Pat, you talk in our work around the application of an iMessage, and you talk about the importance of timing with an iMessage. And it's important that you earn the right before you ask, you play that card. I'm feeling really uncomfortable with you standing on the outside of that guardrail. Can I get you to throw one of your legs back over? Well, if you haven't earned the right, and Pat talks about this in our module, about the importance of, you have to earn that right. You just meet somebody, you've been talking to them for 30 seconds and you play that iMessage card. That's not going to work. It's not going to work at all. And I would put humor, Pat, in that same category, in that you have to earn the right to go down that path. Because I've giggled and laughed and chatted with people about funny things, anecdotal things. I've talked to people about guitar strings. I've talked to people about sports. I've talked to people about all of those different kinds of things. But it's all in pursuit of that rapport building, relationship building, get to influence, and then functionally to a behavior change. So yeah, humor, big deal, good deal. Got to be smart, got to be strategic.
All right, we're going to take a quick break from the Crisis Cop podcast. We'll see you in a few.
Thought about a career in voiceover? Need a great, cost-effective on-hold message for your organization or business? Don't know where to start? Check out The Voice Farm, your one-stop shop for voiceover needs. Check it out now by accessing The Voice Farm at voicefarmers.com and see what difference can be made with a company that is truly outside the box. From the Voice Box, voicefarmers.com. That's voicefarmers.com.
Wouldn't it be cool if your advertising could last forever? It can with perpetual advertising. Here's how it works. Unlike TV or radio ads, where every instance the ads are broadcast, they're only played once and lost forever. Perpetual advertising can have repeat exposure and replayability weeks, months, and even years after they're inserted in a podcast. So even if a podcast is a few years old, your ads will still be impactful to repeat listeners, as well as new listeners. This gives your advertising dollar the most bang for the buck. Find out more about perpetual advertising at twoguystalking.com/sponsors.
Have you got a cool voice? Do you like to act? Are you quick when it comes to thinking on your feet? Want to help propel the future of training crisis negotiators across the globe and foster the future of law enforcement? We need you. It doesn't matter what you look like. Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter what's on your plate. We want your voice to help us evolve the way that law enforcement interacts and succeeds when it comes to crisis negotiation. Ready to get started? Access bluebaggersproject.com and start your role-playing voice adventure today. bluebaggersproject.com. That's bluebaggersproject.com.
All right, so we're back from our break, and we're going to get back to our guest, Gary McDougall. So let's talk about what happens when you have no idea what to say next, Gary. You're kind of in that conundrum of, I've been on the phone maybe an hour, 2 hours, and all of a sudden I'm just hit that roadblock. What do I do? Like, we had that come up a lot, even in class, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a super good question. One of those things that very commonly happens. It's happened to me a number of different times. So in the work that I have done in the past, the three things that I have found that would really, really tend to get us out of trouble when we find ourselves in trouble, because sometimes people say things that we just have no idea how to respond to. Or if you think, man, I'm not really sure what to say here. So a couple of things that I would put on the table as those emergency measures. And the first one, super simple 3-word phrase. And for me, it's tell me more. Because for the most part, people, that conversation is moving on and people don't mind talking about themselves, generally speaking. So for me, tell me more, a very simple 3-word phrase that has pulled me out of trouble a number of different times. So tell me more, which has always historically been a really good strategy for me. The other one is a summary. If people say something and you have no idea what to say back, if you go to a summary, it makes you sound clever. You're still operating in their frame of reference. It's still all about them, and it's meaningful to them because you're talking about things that are important to them. So tell me more gets us down that path. Summary moves us down that path as well. The other piece that I think is really important is that stay away from advocacy. Spend some time in inquiry.
Right.
And just one other thing, Pat, that I'd put on the table just for your consideration for our listeners, is one of the things that happens sometimes is people get on the phone with us, potentially suicidal people are on the phone with us, and they don't want to talk to us. They're not hanging up. They're not disengaging. They're just not willing to engage. They're not willing to talk. So they don't hang up, but they're still online. So the question for us becomes, how is it that we engage someone who is potentially not responding to us at all? And so the one strategy that I've used in the past is using their emotion as a lever to get them engaged. So if someone were barricaded in their home thinking about self-harm, imagine or hunch what emotion you think they might be experiencing. Because if I was barricaded in my home thinking about self-harm, I think I'd probably be feeling really isolated, really hopeless, and really desperate. And so I use that. I would hunch what their emotion might be potentially and characterize it as a hunch. And I'd use provisional language. You know, friend, I'm not in your shoes. And I don't profess to be. But boy, if I was, I can only imagine that I'd be feeling really isolated and really hopeless and really desperate. And that's exactly like baiting the hook when you go fishing. And you cast that out there. I'm not in your shoes. I don't profess to be. And you hunch those emotions. And then you just wait. You subscribe to one of those effective pauses. And I tell you, more than once has that worked really, really effectively, where the subject says, you have no idea how tough this has been on me. My kids don't talk to me. I've got a fentanyl addiction like you wouldn't believe. They're foreclosing on my house, and I've amassed a gambling addiction of $100,000. Well, now we've got some stuff that we can work with.
Right.
What we do is we hunch their emotion and we characterize it as a hunch and throw it out there. And I would recommend that's a really good strategy. So using their emotions as a lever to get them engaged.
You know, it's just funny because I think the tendency in law enforcement is we shy away from emotions, right? We hey, let's not deal with that right now. But that's almost the exact opposite of what we teach in negotiations is, hey, make sure you identify those emotions and throw it at them, because I think that's really gets that conversation going, especially when you correctly identify that emotion, right? You know, hey, you know, that anger comes out and we hit that angry, hey, you know, it seems to me like you're very angry about this. And then bam, it's kind of like we hit that connection, right? So.
Oh, nicely done. And you're identifying what their underlying interest is, what's driving that. And Deb McMahon many times has said that's where the good work happens. Not in that anger piece, but in those primary emotions, whether they're frustrated or disappointed or embarrassed or feel threatened or feel jealous. And Deb talks about that very specifically. That's where the good work happens, is in exploring those primary emotions.
Right. So let's talk about this. I hear this phrase all the time. It's usually from the media or someone else, or maybe from some of the people that don't understand what we do, but negotiations have failed. Negotiations have failed. So we had to do something differently. Do you want to talk about that point for a little bit?
Yeah, I do actually want to talk about that. Thanks. I find that inflammatory and I find that offensive, that negotiations have failed. From my perspective, the only way a negotiation fails is if we don't honor the process, if we don't honor our training. Because I think that a failed negotiation, people often characterize, you know, the subject completes suicide or something really untoward happens. They kill somebody in the crisis point. and people call that a failed negotiation. It's not a failed negotiation. The barometer for whether this is a good negotiation or a bad negotiation, I don't use those words lightly, is the fact that if we stuck to our training, if we did what we've been trained to do, because it's not us, we don't determine the outcome. It's the subject that determines the outcome. And I had a situation in which I was talking to a guy on a bridge. It was the only time it ever happened for me in which somebody jumped in my presence. And in my head, I thought, wow, I really failed. That didn't work very well. Right. The reality was, though, on reflection and through some conversations with some other negotiators, is the fact that wasn't a failed negotiation because he was the one that decided that he was going to jump from that bridge. And as long as we stuck to our training, as long as we honored the process, as long as we worked the skills, stuck to the active listening piece, like I think it would be a failed negotiation if you said, come on, loser, go ahead and jump. I don't think you've got the guts. Like that would be a failed negotiation if we step outside of the bounds or the perimeter of what it is that we do. But you know what? For me, the barometer is whether we did what we are trained to do. And the outcome doesn't determine whether it was a successful or a failed negotiation. So yeah, I push back a little bit when the media refers to a failed negotiation or negotiations are failing.
Right. Another good point you brought up was about, it's that person's decision. I actually just watched an interesting conversation with Gary Nessner and Jack Cambry out of New York. And they talked about, who's the real incident commander in these situations. And they boiled down to actually that subject is really that incident commander because they determine what we do. Right. And a lot of people don't think about that way, but I really started thinking about that. It's like, you know what? That actually makes a lot of sense because a lot of our actions are based on what that subject does. And at the end of the day, if that subject decides they're going to take their own life, that's their choice and that's their decision. I think that's something we really need to think about as we're doing these negotiations.
Right. And with your permission, Pat, I'd like to throw just one more quick teaching point on the table in relation to that very thing is if you are negotiating, if you are in a crisis intervention with a potentially suicidal subject and they jump, you don't need to go and look because I made that grave mistake in that I wanted to see how this whole thing played out. But the reality is we don't need to have those images circulating in our heads, Pat. In the work that we have done, you were in law enforcement for well 25 plus years. I was in it for the same. We've got lots of those images in our heads. And I think that our work is done if the subject decides they're going to complete. And I oftentimes hear first responders or negotiators say, oh yeah, you know what? I really want to get some closure on this. You don't need that. You do not need, because this gentleman jumped and I went to the railing and I watched this guy go. And I just think that we don't need that. We just don't need that. So,
right. So I'm gonna flip the script on you a little bit, Gary. So something we do at the beginning of our classes is we always ask our students, hey, tell us something people may not know about you, something interesting. Let's really get to know you. So we're going to do that, Mr. Gary McDougall. Give us some information, some tidbits on something maybe people just really don't know. You're just not that police negotiator. There's more layers to this skin, right?
Well, I appreciate that. I'm a guitar player, actually. I don't know that a lot of people know that. Let me just characterize that. I'm a terrible guitar player. I've been a student of you play as well?
I've tried. It's
yeah,
very good.
For a bunch of years, and I have no natural talent whatsoever, none whatsoever. So I typically don't play when there's anybody else at home. If my wife's at home, I typically don't subject her to that. So I'm a terrible guitar player, but I'm all enthusiasm, no technique, I would say. The other thing that people typically don't know is that I am a student of Spanish. I've been working to try and learn the language of Spanish. Brilliant language, but I've been doing this for about 3 years, and I'm just absolutely stymied. Absolutely not good at it at all.
Right.
And just like with the guitar thing, I have no natural ability to learn another language. And, at 63 years old, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but I struggle with it. And those would be the two things that typically I haven't shared with a lot of people. But it's about guitar and Spanish for me.
Gotcha. So let's talk legacy, Gary. What legacy do you hope to leave behind in the field of crisis negotiation?
I am proud of the fact that I was on that speaking circuit. Pat, I know you're on that circuit now. I know Harry Drucker's been on that circuit for a long time. Victor Torres is, those gentlemen are, for a very, very long time. And I've spoken at more than 100 crisis negotiation courses across North America, some in Canada, the majority of them in the United States. And I think for me, that legacy would be sharing that information with potentially new negotiators or negotiators who are looking to further our craft. So spoken at more than 100 conferences since 2006 or 2007. I've done, I think probably, or I didn't do the final count, but somewhere around 50 courses for NTOA, some of them in person, some of them virtually, traveling around mostly in the United States, and some of them done virtually. So that would be my legacy. The fact that someone was kind enough to gift me this information and this craft around crisis negotiation, and then having had an opportunity, an absolute privilege to travel to negotiation conferences and spend some time with existing and new negotiators and share that knowledge. If there was one thing, Pat, that I was going to do differently, and it would be, I'd take a page out of your playbook, friend, and I would write a book, or I would have written a book. And that ship is,
my friend, still time. Come on, you can do it. I don't know if you know this or not, but one of the guys, so Jerry Doan, San Francisco, I think he's in his late to early 80s. When I interviewed him for my book, he had kind of mentioned that to me. He's like, man, Pat, I've always kind of wanted to do this too. So just so you know, I think he's kicked out like 5 books now.
Wow.
After, and it was just one of those things that he'd been thinking about. I think he actually had a manuscript sitting around, and he just got inspired. And here's the thing. So one of the things I do for our class is I give out a book list. But what's really, I think, was surprising to me is there's not a lot of police negotiation books out there. I'm going back to the 1970s to now. I mean, probably less than, I'd say, a dozen. So I think people, are missing out. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this Crisis Cop podcast, because getting people like you involved, and the Harry Druckers, the Vince Delfonsos, let's hear their stories. Let's have people actually listen and maybe learn from stuff if they don't get a chance to read a book or go to one of our classes, but they can pick something up, through this podcast.
Yeah, I think that's sage advice. I think that, respectfully though, like that, I think that ship has sailed for me. But, yeah, no, for folks that are up and coming or folks that are thinking about doing that, I think that's great advice by you.
All right, Gary. Well, my friend, thank you for coming out and sharing some wise wisdom. I love listening, some of the banter we have back and forth in class and just sharing our knowledge. And appreciate you coming out on the show. And we look forward to seeing you again.
An honor and a privilege, sir. Thank you so very much.